Have you ever struggled to figure out what are the best camera settings to use for landscape photography? I'm going to cover a technique that I call the priority technique for choosing the best settings any situation that you encounter out in the landscape photography world. If you're new to shooter photography, be sure to subscribe and click that bell to get notified anytime we have a new video so you don't miss a thing. If you don't already have the camera settings cheat sheet that I have on my website, I have a link for that down in the description that you can grab that. And also I cover the same technique in my landscape photography handbook, which you can also download from my website. So let's dig in. What I'm going to do is cover the priority technique, and I'll go through a bunch of photos to show you exactly what settings I used and how I chose those settings. So the priority technique basically works like this. For any given shot, whatever the most important thing is about that shot, you lock in the camera setting that will best capture that, and then you adjust the other camera settings so that they will give you the proper exposure. So I'll go through a bunch of photos to explain what I mean by that. This first photo that we're looking at, I was trying to focus on the splashing of the water, and as you can see, I didn't have higher shutter speed than this to capture really clear droplets of water, but that's not what I was going for. I wanted to see that sort of tumultuous look of the water as it was crashing. So I used a 1/300th of a second, or about 1/320th of a second shutter speed to capture a little bit of the frozen motion, but not a ton of it. Once I locked that in, I realized that I needed a little bit more light because my shutter was going quite fast. So I changed my aperture to f4.0 to open it a little bit wider. And I was pretty good there. I could leave my ISO at 100 because there was enough light. The sun was setting or about to set. So that's how I chose that one. For the next one, this was in Grand Cayman, and while this water looks like it was just really calm and not a big tide, it actually was going in and out pretty quickly. So I chose a pretty high shutter speed of 1/1600th of a second because it was a pretty sunny day that got a lot of my light down, so I didn't have to I could open my aperture a little bit. I kept it at f8.0 because I actually wanted to have a wide depth of field, not a narrow depth of field, so that I could see all the way to the horizon, which you can. But because I did that, because I had a higher or kind of a mid-range aperture with a really high shutter speed, I actually, even though it was a bright sunny day, you can see I had to raise my ISO up just a bit to 320 so that my shot was properly exposed. So that I had enough light since I had closed down some of those other things. Next shot, I've got this bird that was off the coast of South Carolina. You can see some of the droplets of water that are falling that are frozen in time. That's because I had it at 1/800th of a second for my shutter speed, and that was my priority. So as I'm talking about these things, the first thing I'm talking about is the priority. So for me, these first three shots, it was shutter speed. This was a faster shutter speed. I was able to keep it at f7.1, and I left my ISO at 100. I was zoomed in on a 300 millimeter focus, and while I don't normally think of my focal length as something that I would need to consider, it does affect the photo because the further you zoom in, sometimes you tend to lose light. But in this case, I was pretty good. Again, higher shutter speed. So now we're going to move into some of the shots where the priority for me was to have a slower shutter speed. So in this case, back in Grand Cayman, I wanted to show the water as it was retreating and sort of show those streaks that it leaves by naturally. So I actually put this at 4/5 of a second, so it was a much slower shutter speed. The sun was setting. I was able to keep my aperture at f11 because I wanted to be able to see clearly that boat that's there on the horizon, and I had enough light that I could still leave my ISO at 100. This was also a Nikon D500, which has a better sensor to capture light, so I didn't have to raise that ISO as much. But again, this was a slower shutter speed. Again, same thing, same beach actually in Grand Cayman. I was trying to achieve the same shot. I just wanted to show you another example of that. 1/3 of a second this time, aperture of f8 and ISO of 100. Now, going a little bit slower. This was fireworks in Rhode Island, 4th of July. I wanted to be sure that I captured all the things that happen from the beginning of a launch of a firework to the big bang of the firework. So I actually used 5 seconds for my shutter speed in this case, which allowed me to capture all the different progressions that happen in the shooting of that firework. I left it at f16 for my aperture. Because the sun was already down, I used ISO 400 just to round out the proper exposure for this frame. So going even slower now. In this, the most important thing that I wanted to capture, the priority for me, was to smooth out the water at the base of this lighthouse. There were waves that were actually crashing on these rocks. You would never know it because I wanted the water to look kind of smooth and milky. So I actually had a neutral density filter on my camera, which I'll put a little tag up here in the video that you can see another video on how neutral density filters work. But 30 seconds for my shutter speed. That was the priority for me. I wanted a good neutral aperture, 7.1, so that I could capture pretty far into the horizon to keep everything clear. And I only needed ISO 200 because I was letting in a lot of light by having a 30-second exposure. Same thing here, but at nighttime. A 30-second exposure. At night. This was on a beach in South Carolina. That's actually not the moon, by the way. I think that was Venus. It was very, very bright and low in the sky. So 30-second exposure because I wanted to capture the stars, and that's what's needed. I didn't have any filters on my camera, but that's what's needed when you need to capture or when you want to capture stars and things like that. So I had my aperture as wide as the camera would go or as wide as that particular lens would go, f4.0, but that wasn't quite enough light. So I had to raise my ISO to 3200. It was a little bit grainy, and you can see this picture was a little bit smoother than I would like because I had to apply some noise reduction in post-processing, but it still looks pretty good. So again, my priority was the exposure, and I adjusted the other settings appropriately. Similar thing here. I had more light, and the reason I wanted to show you a slightly different shot was because this was shot from the hotel that I was in Gulf Shores, Alabama. Those are actually the oil rigs off the horizon, and you can see the Milky Way in the center. That was my focus. I really wanted to capture the Milky Way, so I knew I needed 30 seconds for my exposure. Again, I left my aperture as wide open as that lens would allow me to, but because I had more light in my shot this time from the hotel, all the lights from the hotel and some of the lights from the oil rig, I was able to use a lower ISO than the previous photo, so about half that, 1600, and it turned out pretty nicely. This is a shot from Ireland. I wanted to show you another one because there's different variations, things that make a big difference. It's still 30 seconds, right? Because I wanted to get those stars. This was a different lens. I was able to go even lower at f2.8. So I had even more light to play with, a light that was entering my lens to hit the sensor. But you can't see it in this shot. But what you notice is it almost looks like daytime when you look down at the ground and at the trees. That's because there was a full moon off to the left. And because the moon was giving off enough light for me to capture the foreground properly, I only had to raise my ISO to 320. So you see the different variations as you go through. Even though you have the same priority, sometimes you need slightly different variations on the other settings that you choose. Lastly, for slow exposure, I have the shot of the Newport Bridge in Rhode Island. This was a little bit better lens, so I was able to, well, no, I also had a lot of light. There were cars that were going by from the road that were actually lighting the beach in front of me, so that was very helpful. And I was only, I only had to use 25 seconds for my exposure. F7.1 just to get that wider depth of field, and then ISO only 800 because again, with the cars going by, I was able to get the foreground lit pretty well. But again, my priority was to capture the stars and the light of the bridge, and that's why I started, as far as the priority technique goes, with my priority being the shutter speed. Getting into moving away from shutter speed as being the priority, now I want to show you depth of field as being the priority. So in this case, I wanted to highlight the texture of this piece of driftwood on the beach in South Carolina. So for that purpose, I wanted to blur the background so that wasn't distracting, but you could still tell where we were because it's blurred, but you can tell that there's seagrass there. So in this case, my priority was aperture. So I started by focusing on my f-stop, which I chose 4.5 for this lens. There was plenty of light, so I was able to keep my shutter speed at 125th of a second and ISO at 100, which is great. As often as I can, when I keep my ISO lower or all the way to the bottom of its level that it will go, that's better, just because I introduce less noise into my shot that way. This ram that was in Ireland, this, I guess, bighorn sheep, again, focusing on his face and kind of blurring out the background, I focused again. My priority was my aperture, so I used 5.3 for my aperture. It was a fairly cloudy day, but enough ambient light so that I only had to use 1/100th of a second and 100 ISO. Blades of grass in California. Again, this is actually, we were getting a slight drizzle that day, but there was still enough ambient light. Again, my priority being the focus of the blades of grass that were in the foreground closest to me. I used f4.0, so a lower aperture, to get that narrower depth of field to focus on those individual blades of grass, and then 1/250th of a second. And then you notice that I raised my ISO to 200 because, again, as I said, it was drizzling on us, so there wasn't as much daylight coming through those thicker clouds. Beautiful, what looks like clover, but I think it's called sorrel, in the redwood forest in Muir Woods in California. Beautiful place if you've never been there. Very dark place because you've got these giant trees that are blocking out the sunlight. So same aperture as the prior shot, 4.0, to really focus on that front flower. A 60th of a second, but my ISO, you can see I had to choose a higher one, 1250, because it was dark enough, right? But again, my priority was the aperture, getting that narrow depth of field, so I had to adjust the other things accordingly. Next shot, an aspen leaf at daybreak in Colorado. I love this shot because I was able to capture the individual droplets on this leaf. Now, you'll look at this and say, okay, yep, I see, Jim, that you were using a lower aperture to get that narrow depth of field, the focus on the leaf, 5.6, but why did you use a 1/500th of a second? Well, it was actually a little breezy that day, so that leaf was whipping around a little bit more than you would think. So I had to make sure that I used a shutter speed that would stop that leaf or freeze that leaf in motion. So in this case, I had two priorities. It was the narrow depth of field with the aperture and the higher shutter speed in order to freeze that leaf in motion. And then from there, I needed a little, because of the shutter speed, the higher shutter speed, I needed more light, or I needed my sensor to be more sensitive on my camera, so I raised my ISO to 400. This next shot in Fripp Island in South Carolina, beautiful sunrise shot. My focus on this one, so I'm moving away from a narrow depth of field focus being my priority to a wider depth of field so that I can see from foreground to background, everything is clear, okay? So my priority was f11 on the aperture so that I could have a wider depth of field. And from there, that told me what I needed to adjust. Because I had, when you close your aperture, you have a higher number. You're closing your aperture, so you're letting less light into your camera, which meant I needed to have 1 second of shutter speed or exposure on my camera in order to let enough light in. And I chose ISO 100 because I really didn't want any grain or noise introduced into my shot. This is actually the same photo shoot, but about 15 minutes earlier when the sun was just coming over the horizon, looking the other direction. And in this case, again, f11, my priority was to be able to get a wide depth of field to see all the way down the beach, and I was able to accomplish that. I think I did have a filter on my camera for this, so I was, even though I had this, I had a filter on my camera, I know, because I was shooting into the sun, and I didn't want my sky to be washed out. So after I chose my aperture, I think I went immediately to my ISO to raise that so that I had enough sensitivity on my camera sensor to let more light in, and then 160th of a second on the shutter speed. This is a beautiful shot from Alaska, kind of near Glacier Bay, and again, going for that wider depth of field, f11, 160th of a second, ISO 100, beautiful shot. This is Grand Cayman. Love that place. Again, wide. My priority was wide depth of field. So again, f11. Sun was going down, so I had to slow my shutter speed down to 1/20th of a second. Obviously, when you're shooting at that low of a shutter speed, in order to not get blur or camera shake, you need to use a tripod, which I was. You see a little bit of blur on the bottom of the catamaran, but it's not that noticeable. Obviously, the catamaran was moving around, so I wasn't moving, but it was. An ISO 100 on that shot. Folks, that's it. I hope you understand priority technique for choosing the best camera settings for landscape photography. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, be sure to subscribe to the channel and check out more videos. We'll catch you soon.